Browne, and today the three that are speaking on behalf of family and friends about their remembrances and tributes to Larry. You see them listed in your bulletin. We'll begin with Leah Watkins, Larry's great niece.
It's been a minute since I've spoken publicly, so please bear with me. I'm Larry's great niece, Leah. Before I share my tribute to Larry with you, I want to take a moment to share how grateful I am for everyone in Uncle Larry's friend care team. The care, compassion, loyalty, and love you all have for one another is so inspiring. I hope that I'm able to build a community with a fraction of the support you all have for one another. The camaraderie you share is beautiful, and I love you for being a constant companion for and friend to my uncle through the years. From the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. When I think of my great uncle, there are a few words that come to mind: supportive, faithful, dedicated, and of course, wine connoisseur. I'll speak to all of those qualities except for wine connoisseur. I think that one speaks for itself. Uncle Larry taught me what unconditional support looks like. Education was always important to the Hill family, and he made sure I knew how proud he was of me while I earned my degree and changed careers. He encouraged me to reach for the stars and keep climbing, but did so in a way that didn't make me feel like what I had accomplished wasn't enough. I'll never forget how excited he was when I told him I was applying for my current job in finance with the school system. You see, he retired from accounting himself and was just as anxious as I was through the application process. He checked in with me frequently and was so excited when I took the position. I spoke to this earlier, but his friend group is a direct reflection of how being supportive of others earns you support in return. He made his own community and ensured he would be cared for when it was his turn. I'm truly in awe of them. Through his faith, he bravely faced a terminal diagnosis and made decisions about his end-of-life care with the help of his closest friends and a wonderful hospice who kept him comfortable. He attributed his strong faith to his parents, who shared their faith with him. He found comfort in dying, knowing that it wasn't the end for him. When I visited in October, he said to me, "If I go tomorrow, I'm at peace with my life and how I lived it." Uncle Larry's dedication was most often seen in the way he cared for his family and friends. Some may think he might have been spoiled being the baby, but I believe that was the farthest from the truth. He shared a story with me from high school where he wanted to purchase gifts for his family but didn't have his own money. He was carrying coal for an elderly neighbor, but it wasn't nearly enough to cover the cost of Christmas gifts for their family. He began skipping his lunch and saving his lunch money to buy gifts. From September to December, he lost 90 pounds from carrying the coal, riding his bike, walking to school, and skipping lunch. That's the definition of dedication to me. He also shared how amazing Pauline, his aunt, and Betty, his first cousin, were to the family when they lost my great-grandfather. Larry was only 17, and the family was struggling financially after he passed. Due to the dedication they had to one another, he never considered leaving home. Between struggling to make ends meet as a young adult when the family's primary source of income abruptly left this earth, and being a member of the LGBTQ+ community, he used his servant's heart to fight for the marginalized. He was dedicated to his volunteer work. He wanted to leave the world a kinder place for those who are seen differently and believed in equal rights for all. From my experience, Uncle Larry loved gently and quietly, but also fiercely. While this world seems a little dimmer without him, we'll look for the ways his spirit shines on, whether in the smile of a stranger, a beautiful bird or flower that makes your heart happy, or an act of kindness you weren't expecting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next we have Hannah Young, also a great niece.
Brevity has never been my strong suit, so I've got notes. Thank you all for being here to celebrate the life of my Uncle Larry. As I'm sure you're all aware, he was a great man. I know that he impacted the lives of so many of us in countless ways, but over the next few minutes I want to talk specifically about how he impacted mine. Throughout my life, I learned a few valuable lessons from Larry. I'll start with the earliest lesson, and this comes from when I was a child. We would often visit Betty and Larry. I don't remember much of that time, as it was over 20 years ago and I was very young. However, I do remember that Betty and Larry always had lots of chocolate, and they always had toys that I loved playing with. The toys were mostly cards and coasters, but that's neither here nor there. I loved them nonetheless. Sadly, I don't remember much about my Uncle Larry from that time, but there are a couple of things that did stand out. First, he was always either out with friends, on his way to go out with friends, or returning from spending time with his friends. This struck me because as a small child, you don't really think about adults having friends or fun, at least I didn't anyway. But Larry's active social life challenged this thought in my young mind. I believe that my Uncle Larry was quite possibly the most popular person in the world. The second thing I remember about Larry from this time is that he always talked about having a glass of wine and how having one every day was good for you. My parents, to my knowledge, did not drink wine. I literally only knew about wine because of my Uncle Larry. And for all I knew, it was a miracle tonic. 20 years later, I don't think my analysis was that far off. Maybe he meant that there were health benefits, or maybe he just thought it was nice to have a little treat. I may never know, but at that point in my life, thanks to Larry, I learned that having fun can continue beyond the age of 5, which made a 5-year-old Hannah very relieved. The next lesson came much later in my life. I was 19 and interning with Gloria Johnson for one of her campaigns. I just stepped out of the KCDP office with a packet of addresses to canvass when I crossed the street and saw, getting out of his car, none other than my Uncle Larry. I yelled across the parking lot, "Larry? What are you doing here?" He looked up, shocked, and said, "Hannah? I'm here for a Knox County Democrats meeting. What are you doing?" I explained that I was interning that summer, and he said, "Oh, well, that's great." And we hugged and both went on about our evenings. And I think this may have been the first time that either of us had seen each other outside of a family gathering. What was so beautiful and memorable about it for me was that we were both there independently of one another. It felt like we had unlocked a new level of our relationship. We were no longer just uncle and niece, but rather colleagues fighting for the same goals. I had no idea how active he was in politics before that, but after, every time that we would see each other, we would talk politics. And I was always very glad to know that my opinion on whichever topic he chose to ask me about that day was the correct one. I learned that activism doesn't stop. It's not just something you do when you're young, but something that you keep up with throughout your entire life. And finally, the last lesson I learned from Uncle Larry culminated a few years ago at my wife and I's wedding. My cousin Leah and Uncle Larry cooked up the idea that Larry and I should share a dance. And we spent much of the evening contemplating which song to dance to. We ultimately landed on Stand By Me by Benny King. And during the dance, Larry told me how much it meant to him to see young members of the LGBT community getting married, and how much it meant to him that after all he had been through, he was there to witness it. I told him how much it meant to me to have him not only at my wedding, but in my life. I told him that I knew what it meant to have him around, and I understood the many challenges that he must have faced to get there. In that moment, looking into each other's eyes, it felt like I was looking through a window into the past and then also into the future all at once. I realized that so much of our lives converged in ways that neither of us could have ever possibly dreamed we'd have with a family member. I'm so very lucky to have a supportive family, but I know that without Larry, it wouldn't be as easy for me, and I think that extends beyond just familial relationships and into the world as a whole. It's people like Larry that paved the way for people like me, and I owe it to his and future generations to keep that momentum going. And I think in this moment, or during that dance, we both realized that we represented resilience and hope to one another. I represented it for him because I get to live a life that he only hoped would be possible, thanks to the efforts of Larry and people like Larry. And he represented it for me because with his resilience and hope, I would have never been where I am at that moment. He was proof to me that I could live a full life with friends, family, and love, despite and in spite of any challenges I may face simply for being who I am. I'll leave you with a summary of what I've learned from my Uncle Larry, because though the memories are mine, I think the lessons are universal. There's always fun to be had. There's always work to be done, and there's always love to give and to receive. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, Roy, your turn. Roy is not a great niece. He is a terrific friend. Here you go, I yield.
When I moved to Knoxville in 1997, Larry was the first person I met, and we stayed friends all these years. He was always available to share his wisdom and advice. He did not judge, but he always had sound judgment. I will remember fondly his ice cream socials and good times with his many close friends. While his ordeal was long and challenging, Larry never once complained or was fearful of the ultimate outcome. I asked him once if he was fearful of the inevitable end of his life. He just said, "No, I have my faith." I am able to carry that same faith with me now when I consider my own mortality. Larry always gave generously, and his sweet spirit will always be with us.
Amen.
Thank you all. Hard to follow that. Okay, so as I mentioned at the very beginning, Larry wanted us to focus today on the goodness of God. You know, goodness is one of those words that sometimes is difficult to pin down. Goodness often means different things to different people. But it seems to always be fairly easy to really recognize goodness when we see it in action. Because goodness is the action of all things working together for the good of all. For the good of all humans, for the good of all creation, for the good of God, God's self. This is certainly true when we talk about the goodness of people. People like Larry, and you heard witness to that in the wonderful stories that came from his family and his close friend. We recognize it in other people, the people we come to see as companions in our own journey in life. We recognize the goodness in those people and in Larry every time we remember how they were with us. We remember about the way they spoke with us, the way they listened to us, and sometimes with us, and sometimes reminded us to listen when we had rather speak than hear. Larry knew how to do that very gently, and it was a goodness that I will always remember him. We recognize the goodness of Larry by remembering the ways he hugged us. I love the Larry hug. You know? Put his arms around you, kind of rub your back a little bit. It's great. Recognize the goodness and how gently he could nudge us as a group towards something. That was true in this parish. For several years, Larry was our senior warden. That's like the president of the board. And he was an incredibly wonderful senior warden. He went about doing his work with a gentle goodness. He would listen to everybody. He would make space for everybody, even the people that were expressing opinions that he was totally against. He would make room for people to be heard, and then he would very gently nudge us in the direction that seemed to be the best possibility available for the good of all. I will miss Larry. I'll miss the gentle voice of his goodness. But I imagine Larry trying to catch my attention about now, to remind me that he wanted me to preach about the goodness of God, not the goodness of Larry. But the divine and human goodness are connected. They go together. And one of the times that connection with divine and human goodness becomes most obvious is at times like these. At moments when kind of the world stops for a little while, and we realize there's a hole in it. In this case, a Larry-sized hole. It's interesting that quite often, it's at those times that we become most open to looking for and recognizing the goodness of God. So much of the time, we're kind of busy, you know. God has to do something pretty spectacular for us to think it's good. But sometimes at these times when it just seems like that hole's there, we begin to look for the goodness. And I think that's one reason Larry wanted me to talk about that goodness today. You see, I think Larry learned that way of nudging people gently towards goodness from his relationship with God. Because that's how God interacts with us. In fact, most of the time we don't even recognize that it's God behind it, and that's fine with God. It was just like it was fine with Larry. He didn't have to be the one that got the credit for it. And I think he learned that gentle way of moving through goodness from his understanding of the goodness of God. And we can see that goodness of God. We can see that goodness in action every moment throughout our lives. And especially as our lives move from one transition to another. I mean, think about it. Think about how every moment of your life involves some kind of becoming, some kind of dying to some other old way of being, and some kind of rising again to some new way of living life. For example, we enter this earthly life we know so well when we release the life we've come accustomed to in our mother's womb. You know, we start off there, you know. And we have to release that life in the comfort and safety of that womb to begin the life adventure that's a constant becoming, releasing, and new becoming as we go through our lives on earth. We leave infancy, we go to childhood, but we can only recognize the true goodness of childhood when we release the expectation, or learn to release the expectation in childhood that somebody's going to show up every time we cry for something. You know, in infancy, that worked pretty well. We have to leave it behind to see the goodness in childhood, or we're just frustrated because we can't get people to do what we want them to do. And then we leave from childhood and we go to adolescence. We leave childhood behind. And yet we can only realize the true goodness of this transition when we release our own childish views of freedom and begin to learn what it means to use our freedom responsibly in ways that bring goodness to others and to all creation. Then, at some point, we have to die to adolescence. We rise to young adulthood, and we have to do what so many people tell me today who are in their process of making that transition. We have to learn adulting, right? And so the pattern goes. Coming, perishing, new becoming. There's always a goodness that flows through it. The goodness of God that flows within us and all around us and through us in each and every transition. We go into our middle years and we release our young adulthood. We go from middle years to an older stage of life. And in each of those, to become what lies ahead, we have to release what was behind. And that's why you'll hear later in a prayer as we bless the wine and bread for communion. At that time, when we celebrate the fact that, yeah, we really are all one together. And in this church, we invite everybody to receive with us communion. And if you don't practice that yourself, just come on up anyway. If you go like this, I'll just say a special prayer for you. Because we are one family of earth, one communion, and we act that out. And the prayer we say reminds us that in death, life is only changed, not ended. So Larry, I think maybe that's what you wanted me to tell your friends and family about the goodness of God. It's certainly what I saw in Larry in the last weeks and months of his life as we talked together in his living room. Certainly what I saw in Larry 2 nights before he died, when I gave him last rites. And he was able still to respond in one way. One word answers usually. Roy was there and Tim was there, and I asked them to just wait in the living room a while so I could spend some time with Larry alone. And I asked him how he was feeling. And he looked at me, he said, "I'm surprised." And I said, "You're surprised?" He said, "Yeah, I'm surprised. I'm dying. I'm shocked. I'm dying." And I said, "Do you want the last rites now?" And he said, "Yeah, I do." And so we came back in and we did that. 2 nights later, I had a dream. I told Larry before I left if he needed me, all he had to do was call. The dream woke me up. And I couldn't go back to sleep. And I kept thinking, I wonder if Larry's dying now. And I kind of did drift off, sort of in a twilight type sleep for a little bit. You know, how those go, you're kind of asleep, but not really, you don't know. And I just had this strong sense of his presence. And I had this strong sense that he wanted to ask me a question. But I didn't see him, and I didn't hear him. It was just a feeling. But in my dream, it was like there were all these clouds. And they were like almost too thick for clouds. They were more like a veil of some sort. Common images. God speaks to the images that are familiar to us. It's not magic. It's just the way our brains happen to work. In that image, the clouds parted, and I could see kind of like the light of dawn. Which, when I look out my window, that's sort of what I see. I see some trees, and there's an opening, and I gradually watch the dawn come in. It was kind of like that. And I looked at it, and I remembered thinking to myself, because I was kind of awake and asleep, and I thought, I wonder if that's where Larry's supposed to go. And so I thought, well, it can't hurt anything. And I said, Larry, if you're wondering if that's where you're supposed to go ahead. I went back to sleep. Woke up about 5 and thought, Larry died. Tim's going to be calling me sometime. Then I got my Fitbit out because it tracks my dreams. And I thought I'd look and see what my pattern was. The last dream I had ended at 3:45. Larry died at 3:45 that morning. So yes, I believe the veil's pretty thin. It's not the first time something like that's happened in my life. It always comes in a very natural way of somebody I miss. All of a sudden, I'm going through a box and find an old letter on the very day that I wish I could talk to my friend. I'm seeing all these thoughts, because you know it, don't you? It happens. It's just that we knock that up to coincidence, you know? And that's okay. God doesn't mind. He doesn't have to take credit. But if you ever are looking in times like these, for the goodness of God. Just pay attention to the nudges. Because God is always within your hearts and all around you. He doesn't wait to be found. It's all up to you whether you see the goodness or not. So Larry, I hope that's what you meant.